Hello and welcome to Heritage Matters, our new weekly show. And let me start by thanking you for being part of it. We've got a fantastic response to the first show that we did last week, and we hope that this will only grow and we will use this platform to mainstream our conversation and discussions on heritage and history. We've got a fantastic lineup for you as always, and today we have a very interesting topic to discuss. We're talking about the Maratha legacy. And why is it that we've lost so much of it in translation? Now, this is a issue that is again not unique to the Maratha legacy alone. It is something which is uniformly a problem across India. Pick up any state in India, we know very little about the regional histories. And one of the attempts that we are doing at the history is to really focus in on the layers that make India, the regional histories, which are very, very important to understand if you want to understand the fabric of India. It is also important to broad base the discussion on regional histories because together we will learn a lot more about events, about how they kind of influenced the scheme of things and history. The Maratha century was a spectacular one in India. The 18th century saw the Marathas rise. Of course, a lot of that happened in the preceding century. But over that 138 years, from the time of Chhatrapati Shivaji to 1818 and the Third Maratha War, Anglo-Maratha War, we saw the emergence of a new wave emanating from Pune and the surrounding areas. And what was interesting was that this was a period of churn, of terrible battlegrounds across India as the Mughal Empire went down and a new force, that is the British East India Company, rose. This interregnum has been written off by most historians in the past as just an interregnum with a lot of confusion in India. But actually, to understand what happened next, you have to understand this period. And that is why we've got a very interesting panel for you. Let me introduce our guests to you, starting with Dr. Uday Kulkarni, who's done a fabulous body of work on this period. He's a trained surgeon from the Navy who rediscovered his passion for history after he came back to Pune and actually went back, starting off with that event, the Third Battle of Panipat, the solstice at Panipat, as he called it, and he worked his way back to really go deeper into this period of Maratha history. We also have Vikram Kirloskar, Vice Chairman of Kirloskar Motor, Toyota Kirloskar Motor, somebody who I have known for many years and somebody who shares a passion for history. He also represents a family that has a very close connect with the history of Pune, the making of Pune, and we will talk a little bit about that and how we can broad base this interest in history. We also have Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, who is the chairman of SVP Social Venture Partners, and also he chairs a very interesting initiative in Pune called the Pune City Connect, which really is an attempt to get citizens of Pune involved in the development of Pune, in the infrastructure development of Pune, in the conversation around Pune with the different stakeholders. We also have a very special guest joining us all the way from Raveri. A young is really an inspiration. And I'm telling you, we've been working with Gaurav Mandle for some time. And I must tell you that he's doing some fabulous work in Raveri. And he's really doing what we all talk about doing, but he's making that change on the ground. Because in his teens, Gaurav realized that in his village was this amazing historical monument that was going to dust quite literally. And we're talking about Baji Rao's Samadhi in Raveri. And he, very early in his life, got involved with an attempt to kind of restore it, get public participation towards it. And he was so inspired by that, he actually went and studied heritage management, and he's back at Raveri. So this is a great opportunity to get Gaurav to talk about what he has been doing in Raveri. But before we get into the discussion, Dr. Kulkarni, let me look at the work that you have done and also introduce to our viewers the Maratha century, so to say, that period when the Marathas rose. I'm going to start by asking you, from this Panipat solstice all the way to your latest book, which is on Nana Sahib Peshwa, which I have a copy of with me. You've actually gone back deeper and deeper into Maratha history. What the insights you got with this in this journey, and also tell us uh, how you see the rise and spread of the Marathas through your research.
It's a very long question, so I'll have to give a long answer too. Basically, I was
That's the idea.
always I was always interested in history from my school days. My grandfather used to have a big library with a lot of history books. He used to tell me stories. I used to read those books. And for some time in school, I wrote a book in on a school notebook. I was in a school, so I wrote in a book, and I kind of thought it's a professional work. Of course, then you go into medical school, and next 30, 35 years, you're lost in your world of medicine and surgery and your post graduation. But along the way, you're reading about history because that is what you're interested in, along with other books. And sometime in 2009, actually, I started thinking that the books that I was reading about history, about various people who had authored books on history of that time, I found that they were either having some kind of a slant, or they were biased in one or the other direction, or the representation of facts was skewed because of some personal bias against a particular person or so and so. So since 2011 was the year when Panipat was into its 250th year, completing 250th, I thought I'll start with writing a monograph on that subject, which eventually expanded to become a book. And this happened very serendipitously. I did not plan to become an author, and nor had I planned to be a publisher. However, publishing industry is mostly Delhi centric, and sometime in the past, in the early 2000s, I'd got a compilation of essays which my mother wrote. This was on a different subject, and I had published that as a book. I said that we'll publish it. So, and I managed to sell 1,000 copies in a few years, which actually gave me an insight into the way the publishing and the printing industry works and how the books are sold. So when I finally finished writing my book in January 2011, I had no time to go to a publisher and send my manuscript where it'd be lying in the bookshelf for 6 months. I didn't know anybody in Delhi. So I said, let me do it myself. And I told my wife that I'm going to spend so much money for this. And if it goes, it goes. So I had gone to Panipat and Najibabad and Shukratal and gone all those places to get a first-hand impression of the topography and so on. So when I came back, I started writing. I finished the book in 3 months. January it was ready, and in April we published it. And to my good fortune, or to the good response from the viewers, it got sold out in the year. It came with second edition, came out soon after that, and that gave me an impetus to continue working on further books on history. During this time, I was reading a lot, and I found some articles which mentioned that some papers had been taken by English officers in India 200 years back to England. People who were officers in Satara and Pune, like Charles Mallet was the resident in Pune, or General Briggs was the resident in Satara. And these references kept coming. Like, there was a historian called Parasnis who wrote this in 1907 in an article on Maratha historiography. He wrote it again in 1920s. So 17, 18 years apart, he could not get those documents. And there's one mention in that these documents were deposited with the Royal Asiatic Society in London. So I got in touch with them and I started uh, prodding them that this is very important. These papers will give us some insight on the 18th century. And the librarian over there at that point in time, Kathy Lazenbat, her name was, she took a lot of personal interest. She dug out the physical archives of the society. And finally, in the last box, as she says, she found those documents and she kind of said, I've got them. So then I was going to London sometime that year. So I went there in 2013 and had a look at those papers. There were 200 papers were there. I'm sure there were more, but the ones they found were 200. So I got copies made of those, came back here, transliterated them from the Modi script into Devanagari, and I wanted to translate it because my main purpose in writing this entire thing was, you'll find a lot of Maratha history, except for very few exceptions, has been written in the Marathi language. And a lot of people outside Maharashtra are not even aware of what the Marathas have actually done. I was, in fact, when I published my first book, I got a phone call from a retired brigadier in the Maratha Light Infantry who was settled in Chandigarh and who said that till I read your book, I didn't know the Marathas came to Panipat. So that is a kind of ignorance that I came across. Therefore, that kind of reinforced me that I must write in English and it must be written for people. Because even the next generation of the people who speak Marathi have started reading in English. So
Right.
it was important
I
to
have
me.
a question over here because your next book was also interesting because it was a translation of a Bhakkar, which is
That's right.
really a contemporary account of a person who was at Panipat.
That's right.
Not only did you go all the way to London to actually find, and I'm sure after Mallet you would be the last next person to actually have gone through all those
So actually,
letters, but you also looked at local records, which is also interesting because very often, and that's where this whole title of lost in translation comes, because a lot of our regional histories are actually lost because we're not able to access it
that's right.
because of
That-
the language barrier, because of the geographical barrier. So, what are the insights that these new finds gave you?
Actually, the Bakhar is basically a subjective personal account written for somebody else, practically on commission. Like that particular ruler or the noble tells the person, please write a history of Panipat for me. There were no printed books available, so he kind of wrote different versions for different people. And in the sometime in the 19th century, a few of those samples were traced by one of very early historians, but they were all incomplete because they had not been preserved properly. Last 5 pages are missing of some, that kind of thing. So they were all patched up together and somehow brought up. And this one was a complete history because on 1st of 91, Charles Mallet hires a clerk given there and he writes the English date, 1st January 1791, on the day on which he transcribed that, wrote that Bakhar. So that entire 80 pages were taken back by Mallet to England when he went in 70, resigned from the East India Company. And he planned to write a history of the Marathas after going back there. But when he went back there, he never got around to doing it, and the documents were lying with him until finally they were deposited in the Royal Asiatic Society. General Briggs was a resident at Satara. He was very close to the family of Nana Fadnavis, who were at Menavali. And Nana Fadnavis's wife actually gave him some very valuable original records or letters, some of them written in Nana Fadnavis's own handwriting. Like you'll find the will of Madhavrao Peshwa written in Nana Fadnavis's own handwriting. Or there's another document where he gives the distribution of his crores of rupees which he had. So these documents I got from there, out of which the Bakhar of Panipat, being an 80-page document, that is what I translated into Devanagari and published after translating it in English.
Now, for our viewers who are joining us from different parts of the country and will be seeing it subsequently even from outside India, I want to quickly ask you, what is amazing about the Maratha Empire is that while we know about Chhatrapati Shivaji and the fact that he created that kernel of that great Maratha state, it was under the Peshwas that it really spread its wings. And you had regular people who were shepherds, who were people who were working on fields, suddenly become generals and march, and at one point go from Katak to Atak, as it is said, and leave behind their legacy. In fact, much of their legacy is still there in far off Thanjavur, in Jinji, in Sambur, in Karnataka, and we will come to that particular legacy. But what made the Marathas rise and succeed in that very, very difficult period?
Actually, it's not a very good idea to divide the Maratha period into the 17th and 18th century because that kind of split narrative. Had Chhatrapati Shivaji not begun the movement which he began in the 17th century, there would have been no 18th century history. So
Absolutely.
it was a momentum which gradually built up, which finally yielded results in the century to come. Now, the reason why this happened was that actually it started even a generation before Chhatrapati Shivaji. His father was the one who initially tried to establish an independent principality of his own because even he tried to prop up the collapsing kingdom of Ahmednagar from the Mughal onslaught. When Shah Jahan came down to south to attack Ahmednagar and Akbar came down, it was Shahaji Raja actually who propped up Ahmednagar. And when that failed, he went down to Bijapur, took up service there, had his own establishment in Bangalore and so on. So the example of his father was there. His mother was another very nationalist lady, and everybody in Maharashtra knows her. And from these kind of, he could not tolerate the yoke of, kind of slavery which was being imposed on his people. And uh, there was definitely a situation where some people were second class citizens and some people were not. So that situation was not could not be tolerated by him, and that was a stimulus for starting this, and it was a very strong stimulus for him to start this movement. If you read the Masire Alamgiri, which is the court history of Aurangzeb, uh, a friend of mine who researched into this has found that there were 23 revolts against Aurangzeb during his 50 years that he ruled. It was the 23rd revolt alone that succeeded. That was a revolt of Chhatrapati Shivaji. So it was Maharashtra was already in the battlefield before that. The nobles were either fighting for the armies of Bijapur or Ahmednagar, and
Sure.
they were in the field. But then they started fighting on their own account when they had a king, an inspirational leader, and that's how the kingdom started. So that's the kernel or the nidus from which this whole thing grew up in the following 150 years.
Absolutely. But what is interesting also is that when we look at history, and because we have such a large country with so many arms and parts, we always look at it from a peripheral point of view, right? So in the Marathas, you have them coming in, you have them crossing over, waging battles. They were known for taking up the chort, and in certain categories, there's also a very unique dimensional way in which we look at history, right? Which, as a researcher and as a historian, you would agree is limiting the scope of history. So I must ask you about the other side of this Maratha thing. One is, of course, that they were very successful, but they were also accused, for example, in Bengal. There is a Maratha ditch where they were accused of coming and running raids into Bengal, right? You have a situation in Sringeri Mutt. But what is interesting is your research has brought out some very interesting facets of these aspects, which a lot of others have just regurgitated and spoken about. But the nuanced take that you have given is very interesting because, very often in history, it's not as it seems. It requires a look at multiple dimensions to understand a particular event.
So actually, the Marathas been fighting a violence after the death of Chhatrapati Shivaji for almost 27 years, when the emperor himself, and that led to a momentum. It was a grassroots movement. In 1700, you find the king himself is both the children of Chhatrapati Shivaji are no more. 1700, and probably at that time the Mughal emperor would think that that's the end of the story. The Marathas have finally been vanquished, because as he had vanquished Bijapur and Golconda. And surprisingly, you will find that when the kingdom of Bijapur is subjugated or Golconda is captured, there is no grassroots resistance to the Mughal there. On the other hand, in Maharashtra, though the kings have both been have no more, the grassroots movement continued, and that is what, there were no leaders. There were kind of ministers who are in various forts and directing the movement, and that movement continued at that point in time. So there was a very strong momentum which came up. Once there's a clear watershed in the history when Aurangzeb died, and the second part of the movement started when the Mughals began withdrawing towards the north and became weaker, while the Marathas, with their momentum, already during Aurangzeb's time, they were already crossing the Narmada and going into Malwa. Nemaji Sinde was one of the ones crossed into the Malwa even in 1690s. So this momentum carried on, and eventually that led to the establishment of Chhatrapati Shahu, who was Shivaji's grandson. Now Shahu had been in Aurangzeb's prison for a fairly long time, so he had no experience in battle, and he was a very pacific person.
Sure.
His long rule of 40 years, which his moderation actually helped the Maratha kingdom to grow.
Right. What's also interesting about Chhatrapati Shahu is the fact that he had while in today's history you look at it on a very, very black and white kind of way. It is seen as communities against each other, outsiders versus insiders, and all of that. What is also interesting, I remember talking to you, is that Shahu had a a protective kind of a demeanor towards the Mughals in the later period because he was close to Aurangzeb's family. And he had promised Aurangzeb while he was dying that he would protect the Mughal throne. And that's what they did all the way till the Third Battle of Panipat, where the Marathas became so-called kingmakers or at least protectors of the Mughal court. That those nuances are somehow
again this is
aside.
a very I mean, this is the overt look at it, but there were, as you say, a lot of things which are not obvious to people, like when the first thing that Bajirao said when he came to became the Peshwa was that strike at the roots and the branches will come down at himself. He very, very clearly meant that it has to be Delhi which you have to attack and subjugate. And till the 1730s, Delhi was opposing him. They were not protecting the Mughals during Bajirao's time. Bajirao had to repeatedly go. He first captured Malwa, Bundelkhand, Gujarat. They were all assimilated. He had even gone all the way south up to Srirangapatnam. It was after 1730s that when the Mughal emperor would not hand over the province of Malwa to him, that he went to Jaipur, Udaipur, tried to use diplomacy at first to get his way because Savai Jai Singh of Jaipur was in his favor. When that didn't work, he led a huge army to Delhi and reached the suburbs of the city. And the emperor that the Marathas are here at your door. And it was only after that, of course, Bajirao Sahib died 3 years later. But in 1741, Malwa was ceded to the Marathas to his son, Nana Sahib, in the following years. So the adversarial relationship was there for a few decades, during which time the Mughals progressively became weaker. The death knell for the Mughals came when Nadir Shah actually came in 1739. And in 1740s, again the Marathas, the four invasions of the Marathas to the north during Nana Sahib's time, Raghuji Bhosle went to the Carnatic, went to Bengal. And it was around this time that the Mughals were so weak that they signed off a few provinces to the Marathas, that we will give you this province in exchange for being protected against the internal and external enemies of the emperor. So once that was signed, they were responsible for the emperor. That was in 17. So
Okay.
I can go on. You can.
Yeah, I know, and I don't want this to be a history lesson because we must broaden the scope, but I do want people to get a perspective on what we are talking about so that they can also make sense of what the challenges there are.
That's right.
I'm going to ask you one uncomfortable question, Dr. Kulkarni, and then open it up to everybody. Because the moment you touch regional histories, you are going to rub somebody or the other the wrong way because, these were tumultuous times, right? So as a historian, we always go with hard facts, and a very balanced approach to looking at history. So, as a researcher, as a historian, how have you approached some of the more difficult aspects of this period, and what are the insights that you have?
The first thing I would take issue with is the word regional history. Okay. Because in the 18th century, the Marathas were anything but regional. You will call the Marathas as a regional power if you're looking at it from Delhi.
Sure.
So this is the problem is that we are looking at history from Delhi. In schools, we are rattling off the names of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal emperors, and then we are considering that this happened in this region, that happened that region. In the 17th century onwards, the focus of events moved to Maharashtra, and the 18th century was the century of the Marathas, as I keep saying. Just look at it this way: in the year 1700, Rajaram dies, and 1707.
Tarabai is fighting the Mughals.
Tarabai fought a 7-year rearguard battle against a very powerful Mughal emperor, a very obstinate Mughal emperor. 1707 he dies, the Mughals start withdrawing because they had another war of succession coming up. In 1719, the first Maratha armies are in Delhi and they are changing emperors at that point in time. So the Maratha century started fairly early on in the 18th century, right up to the year 1800, when again you find that the Marathas the English had just begun to come up because there are events happening within the Maratha fort. Years, even in spite of Panipat, in spite of the early death of Madhavrao Peshwa, in spite of not having a Peshwa and not having a Chhatrapati for the last 40 years, it was by the work of Mahatji Shinde and Nana Fadnis that they could sustain themselves to 1802.
Right. So, Dr. Kulkarni, you haven't really answered my question, but I will come back.
Can you repeat that?
I will come back to you, but let me broad base this question. So, and I want to revisit this because, that period had many interesting facets, and while you have focused on the Peshwas and the march up north, you would agree that there are many areas that require even deeper analysis and research, and I want to come to that because one quick question on that, and then we will go to Vikram. My question is that why do you think that we are not doing enough to research? I mean, for example, I would say Tarabai, for instance, is a fabulous figure from that period who rises and takes on the Mughal might for 7 years. And interestingly, she sees through this entire phase of the build-up of the Marathas, and she dies a year after the Battle of Panipat. You go down south, you have Thanjavur, for instance. You have Ekoji, who sets the Maratha house over there. And again, there's a great flowering, cultural flowering under that branch of the family. Now, my question to you is, what are the challenges you see? Why is it that we've not opened up many of these areas for research, for historic study, for cross-examination, for understanding deeply? Why is it that we've had such a unidimensional look at history?
For one, documents are not available to Marathi speaking scholars because they have never been translated. The sheer volume of Marathi documents that even those which are published, I have not finished reading all of them. There are thousands and thousands of published letters, and there are lakhs of unpublished documents which are lying in the Pune archives and so on. So these have not been properly studied. Even those which are published are not known. Like the story of Sringeri, which you mentioned sometime earlier. There are several Marathi letters which actually lay down the story of what actually happened at Sringeri. And even about Bengal, I had mentioned a few days back about how the Marathas happened to be in Bengal. And I had also mentioned it, the whatever happened in Bengal has been overstressed by our historians rather than, I would say Marathas were a very mild form of invasion. If you see Bajirao's 20 years, he formed an empire from two districts. But have you ever heard of a single battle where he indulged in slaughter of non-combatants or the people who had surrendered to him? Or at any point in Maratha history, the battle never ended with a soldier being defeated. They had a treaty, they had some give and take, and the matter ended there. So the attitude towards history is quite different. And I would like to present history, which is, in one Sanskrit word to call it Shashwat. It need not be influenced by the needs of the day. In 1947, you wanted to write a certain kind of history for a certain purpose. And before that, the British wanted to write the history for a certain purpose. You can write a history which will stand the test of time if you
Absolutely.
base it on authentic documents. And my whole intention is to do that. I would like to tell it warts and all. I would not like to say, of course, if you can't tell a story with all its deficiencies, there are two things you can do. Either you mention it in the generic form without naming names, or you don't tell it at all.
Absolutely. I completely second that. And I think that's what, I really appreciate with your work is that, you've taken the pain to go back and actually look at it with a very balanced research and scientific point of view. So, Vikram, let me get you into this conversation. The whole idea of Heritage Matters is to broaden the scope of the conversation on history and heritage, right? Your family has such a deep connection with Pune and the history of the region. And yesterday I must tell you, we put out a post, Vikram, about how during the First World War, Chhatrapati Shahu Maharaj of Kolhapur gave all the cannons of Panhala, the great fort of Panhala, to your great grandfather so that he could turn that into agricultural equipment for the people because there was a huge shortage of iron. And that post went viral. So, I'm going to ask you, I know that you were planning after your presidentship of the CII, which finished last year, to actually travel with Dr. Kulkarni. And I'm glad I'm connecting both of you on this platform together. So, you can continue your travels. But what got you interested back in history and what was your engagement with that part of your family's history, which was so closely connected with you?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. And for me, this is quite amazing to be on a show with Dr. Kulkarni, who I've admired a lot ever since I read his first book. In fact, Dr. Kulkarni, I bought loads of your books and circulated them.
Thank you.
Because I enjoyed them so much, I've forced many people to read them. So that's a really big honor for me, and I'm really that you. Yeah, can I just go? I have some views on humanities and history. One of the problems in my generation, I don't know how it is in school today, but I suspect it's the same. It was like in Lawrence School, the clever guys did science, medium clever guys did commerce, and the duffers did humanities. That's the way it was. The three areas were classified, and the only sort of humanities I learned was English literature in school. When I went to America in college, I got hit by suddenly that you have to do a humanities course every term. I didn't do any history that time. I just I did mostly literature, literature and theater. Uh, but when I came back, it was work, work. One of the books which my father gave me, he used to be friends with Margaokar, Manohar Margaokar, was a book called The Devil's Wind. And it's a fiction book, but it's about the last Peshwa. And it's very, very fascinating. So that's the first time I really heard of the Peshwas, except Peshwa Park and stuff like that in Pune. You know, besides Shivaji, it was suddenly, for me, it was Devil's Wind was Nana Sahib. Then after my grandfather died, I was going through his books and things, I found Grandduff's History of the Marathas, which actually I read, I think, most of it. And then I was told that this is really the only definitive kind of a document that is available in English, which sort of puts it, or as much of it together as possible. So I read most of it. And what fascinated me in that whole thing was how were these armies able to move across the country so fast in all kinds of weather. And they're talking of 50,000 people, 100,000 people. That requires logistics, it requires management, it requires fantastic HR, and so many things it requires to make this successful. So there must be there were skills there, which we have obviously forgotten. And after that, I've read, of course, Dr. Kulkarni's books. The first book was so fascinating. I read it twice. And I keep imagining these three young Peshwas, very youngsters, and saying they're fighting for the Mughal emperor, and there's no statue of any of them in Delhi. It's really sad. They're the ones who protected Delhi. And I've asked so many politicians that, why don't you have statues of these three guys in Delhi? No answer. But why is there even a name of Bajirao Peshwa Road in Delhi? And also there is no answer.
There is a Peshwa Road.
There's a Peshwa Road, but Bajirao Peshwa Road, important one, is not there. So these are the kind of things. So I started getting fascinated by history. For me, history is now becoming most interesting to me. I'm not an expert. It's only what little bit I have read. I've not done any personal research. But even in life, as society progresses, I think it's important to understand what happened in the past. I sincerely believe, like I think Jung, whatever he said about collective consciousness, that it does work. The father is the son is the father of man. It remembers in your intelligence remains in your genes as you go forward. Yes, technologies change. We're talking on video and all that, but still thinking, it doesn't change. This is one thing which has always fascinated me. How did these people run the country? It's amazing how they collected money, how they ran the country. We have tough times running 3 factories at times, and how did they do that across the country? The second thing that always and that I keep thinking about, India was a manufacturing country. There couldn't have been so much revenue, so much money collected. The numbers they talk about in his books about the ransom paid and all that. These are huge numbers in those days. I always wondered, where did this money come from? It's coming out of some value addition. It can't be just agriculture. There had to be some kind of manufacturing. And somewhere along the way in India, we've lost our way in manufacturing. And I feel we've lost our way in manufacturing because we have not given enough respect for the arts. Like I believe if you want to know how a machine works, you have to know how your hand works first. Only if you understand how your hand works and what you can do with your hands, you can know what your machine works. And somewhere we have missed this whole thing.
Absolutely. Vikram, you couldn't have said it better, because I must tell our viewers, that's one of the things that we've been trying to do. For 2,000 years, India was the place for the most luxurious products of the world. There is a theory that the Roman Empire went down because the Romans couldn't get enough of Indian luxuries, and they were pushing all their bullion into India. And that's exactly the point that you're making, that we were a country known for many, many things, and we were a hub for manufacturing, we were a hub for a lot of interesting industries. And we have no memory of it. And right now, our attempt is really to open up the mind and talk about those things. And also get people like you to give a different perspective. Ganesh, I want to get you in here. So, it's the way, it's the angle from which you see history, right? Vikram has put a very interesting thought process saying that what was the thinking? How could Bajirao was 20 when he started out. He was 40 when he died. He never lost a battle in his life in the 20 years that he marched. I mean, what an amazing thinker he would be. So much of work has been done on Napoleon Bonaparte as a great general, all of that. But we know so little about the thinking of Bajirao. As somebody who's been at the forefront of the technology world, when you look at history, what are the questions that come to your mind? What are the interesting perspectives that you would like to find out?
Well, Minnie, I think, and having listened to Dr. Kulkarni, and of course, my good friend, Mr. Vikram Kirloskar, I think it's amazing how much you have to know to hear and so on and so forth. My own feeling is that in most of the work I do today in the social sector and in building equity between parts of the country, reducing divisibility,